Welcome, my friend. Get comfortable. Take a breath. Let the noise of the day fade out for a moment. Tonight, we're stepping into ancient Rome. Not the Rome of marble postcards and heroic statues, but the Rome that existed after the cheering stopped. After the battles were won. After victory was declared. This is a story about what happened next. Because Roman history loves to talk about triumphs, parades, banners, generals, and gold. But it often stays quiet about the people left behind when the army moved on, especially the women. So here's the question that guides this entire journey. When Rome conquered a city, what really happened to the women who survived? And before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. If you had lived in ancient Rome, would you rather die quickly in war or survive as a captive of the empire? You can answer honestly in the comments. There's no right answer. Rome didn't give one either. Now let's begin. Rome loved victory, not the quiet kind, not the respectful kind. Rome liked victory loud, public, and unforgettable. When a Roman army won a war, it didn't just redraw borders. It rewrote lives. Cities were burned, temples stripped, leaders executed or paraded in chains. And the survivors, those unlucky enough to live, were counted, sorted, and redistributed. To Rome, conquest was not complete until everything had value. Land, gold, labor, and people. From Gaul to Judea, from Germania to Britannia, Roman campaigns followed a familiar rhythm. The legions arrived, resistance collapsed, and when the fighting ended, captives were gathered. Men, women, children, but they were not treated the same. Strong men might be sent to mines or construction projects where death came slowly. Some were trained as gladiators, prepared to bleed for public entertainment. Children could be absorbed into Roman households, raised without memory of where they came from. Women, however, occupied a different category altogether. They were rarely killed outright, not because Rome was merciful, but because they were useful alive. Today, spoils of war sounds almost symbolic. In ancient Rome, it was painfully literal. Captured women were trophies, living proof that Rome had crushed not just armies, but families, bloodlines, and futures. Their bodies became symbols of dominance over land, over enemies, over identity itself. Roman law made this official. Once captured, a woman lost every legal protection she had ever known. She was no longer a citizen, no longer a daughter or wife in the eyes of the state. Under Roman law, she became res, a thing, property. And property, by definition, exists to be used. Here's a harsh Roman calculation. A dead captive produced nothing. A living one could cook, clean, weave, serve, entertain, and bear children. She could be sold once or many times. Her survival created profit, comfort, and status for others. So Rome let women live. And in doing so, It sentenced many of them to a fate that stretched on for years, sometimes decades, without autonomy, without consent, and without escape. This wasn't a single moment of violence. It was a system. Now let's clear something up, because movies have done real damage here. There is no solid historical evidence that gladiators, as a group, routinely assaulted female prisoners after victories. Gladiators themselves were usually enslaved, owned, and tightly controlled. Their violence happened on a schedule, in an arena for an audience. But gladiators existed inside a Roman culture that turned human suffering into spectacle. The same society that applauded death in the Colosseum also normalized the exploitation of captive women behind closed doors, in homes, brothels, workshops, and imperial estates. Different settings, same worldview. Roman generals didn't just defeat enemies, they humiliated them. Captured women were sometimes paraded during triumphs, displayed as proof that Rome had conquered not only territory, but identity itself. To the Roman crowd, these women were symbols. To their enemies, they were reminders that resistance ended in total erasure. Rome understood something uncomfortable about power. To break a people, you don't just defeat their soldiers. You control their future. And controlling women meant controlling generations. If you read Roman historians, you'll notice something unsettling. They rarely describe sexual violence in detail, not because it didn't happen, but because it didn't need explaining. To Roman readers, the phrase "they were enslaved" said everything. The rest was understood, normal, expected. That silence is not innocence. It's normalization. So when we ask, what happened to female prisoners after Roman victories? We're not asking about a single crime or a single villain. We're asking how an entire civilization turned survival into a sentence, and why, for countless women, death might have felt like the only form of freedom Rome never managed to take away. The laws that erased women on paper long before their lives were erased in reality. Because before Rome broke bodies, it broke people with law. Rome didn't need chaos to destroy lives. It preferred paperwork. Before chains were placed on wrists, before names were taken away, before bodies were reassigned to new owners, Rome did something far more efficient. It made everything legal, because once something is legal, it no longer feels cruel. It feels normal. Rome operated under something called ius gentium, the law of nations. It sounds civilized, almost friendly. In reality, it was Rome's way of saying, these rules apply to everyone who isn't Roman. Under this system, prisoners taken in war were automatically stripped of legal personhood. They were no longer protected by any law that mattered. No trial, no appeal, no rights to their body, labor, or future. Female captives became non-persons the moment they were captured. Rome didn't need to hate them. It simply didn't recognize them. And that distinction made all the difference. Roman legal texts are cold, efficient, almost impressive in how little emotion they use. A woman captured in war became serva, a slave. That one word erased. Her family ties, her cultural identity, her consent, her legal protection. She could be sold, given away, rented, inherited, used as payment for debt. And here's the key point. Roman law did not recognize sexual violence against enslaved women as a crime. Why? Because property cannot be violated, only used. Many people imagine enslaved women working quietly in kitchens or gardens. Some did, but Roman households were not gentle environments. Enslaved women could be assigned multiple roles at once. Cook by day, servant by night, sexual property whenever demanded. There was no category separation. Rome did not believe a woman had one purpose. It believed she had no purpose of her own. And if she resisted, punishment was legal. If she became pregnant, the child belonged to the owner, not to her. Here's where we start to understand why ancient survival could be worse than death. Death and suffering. Enslavement extended it. Every morning, a captive woman woke up knowing her body was not hers. Her name was no longer used. Her future had already been decided. Resistance meant pain, not justice. There was no end point, no sentence length, no release date. Just time, years of it. Roman poets like Juvenal and Martial didn't write legal textbooks. They wrote satire, jokes, insults, and that's where things get revealing. They casually reference elite men keeping enslaved women for pleasure. They mock women's origins, their accents, their foreignness. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Satire only works when the audience recognizes the behavior, which means this wasn't rare. It was common enough to joke about. This is uncomfortable, but important. Rome did not consider itself cruel. Romans believed order mattered more than mercy. Stability more than empathy, power more than consent. In their worldview, a woman captured in war had lost not just the fight, but her claim to autonomy. Her suffering was not injustice. It was consequence. Harsh, yes. Logical to Rome? Completely. Unlike death, enslavement didn't just affect one person. Children born to enslaved women were slaves by default. Entire bloodlines vanished into ownership. Languages disappeared. Family names ended not with funerals, but with paperwork. Rome didn't just conquer territories. It edited humanity. Quietly. Legally, efficiently. Rome never asked whether survival was merciful. It asked whether survival was profitable. And for women captured after victory, the answer was almost always yes. Which brings us to the next layer of this story, the one Rome displayed proudly, in public with cheering crowds and official ceremonies. Because some suffering wasn't hidden. Some of it was meant to be seen. Rome didn't hide its victories. It advertised them loudly. If you were a Roman citizen on the day of a triumph, You didn't need a history book to know who had lost a war. You could see it walking past you in chains. And very often it was a woman. A Roman triumph was not a parade. It was a performance. The streets were cleared. Temples were opened. Incense burned. Musicians played. Senators wore white. The general rode through the city like a living god. Behind him came a proof. Captured weapons. Foreign gold. Exotic animals. And finally, captives. Kings. Warriors. And women. This was Rome saying, look what we took. Men represented military defeat. Women represented total defeat. A conquered woman meant her people were broken. Her gods had failed. Her future now belonged to Rome. In Roman eyes, this wasn't cruelty. It was messaging, and Rome was excellent at messaging. Sometimes women were dressed in foreign clothing to emphasize their otherness. Sometimes they were stripped down, not for shock, but to communicate ownership, to remove dignity, to turn identity into spectacle. Rome understood something dark but effective. Humiliation lasts longer than fear. The crowd wasn't passive. Roman citizens cheered. They laughed. They pointed. They commented. Children watched. This wasn't accidental. Rome trained its people to associate victory with domination, to see suffering as proof of order, to feel pride instead of discomfort. And when discomfort did arise, Rome wrapped it in ritual. Ritual makes cruelty feel official. Triumphs were only the beginning. Roman games often included staged reenactments of myths, and many of those myths involved female suffering, abductions, punishments, sacrifices. To a Roman audience, these weren't warnings. They were entertainment. And sometimes the performers weren't actors. They were captives. Here's something important. Roman writers rarely describe these performances in detail. They mention them briefly, casually, like weather. Why? Because the audience already understood what was happening. The spectacle wasn't meant to shock. It was meant to affirm power. And power, when normalized, doesn't feel violent to those who benefit from it. This is where people often get confused. Gladiators fought for entertainment. Captive women were used for demonstration. Different purposes. Same system. Both existed to remind Rome of its dominance. Both were controlled. Both were owned. But gladiators had rules, training, and sometimes even admiration. Female captives had none of that. No applause. No honor. Just exposure. Imagine standing in that crowd. You're not cheering. You're not screaming. You're just watching. A woman passes by. She doesn't resist. Not because she accepts her fate, but because resistance is pointless now. Her city is gone. Her family is gone. Her name may already be forgotten. The crowd sees a symbol. Rome sees success. Only she feels the cost. Rome didn't need to torture publicly. Public humiliation was enough. It sent a message across the empire. This is what happens when Rome wins. And Rome won often, which means this wasn't rare. It was routine. Once the parade ended, the noise faded. The incense burned out. The crowds went home. The banners were folded away. And for the women who had been marched through Rome as symbols of defeat, something far worse began. Privacy. In public, a captive woman was a message. In private, she was an asset. Once sold or assigned, she vanished from history's stage and entered Rome's most powerful institution, the household. Roman homes were not just places of family. They were centers of labor, hierarchy, discipline, and control. Every enslaved person had a role, and enslaved women were expected to perform several at once. They cooked meals they would never share, cleaned rooms they could never rest in, cared for children who were not theirs, and, often without ceremony or warning, they were expected to provide sexual access on demand, not as a favor, as a function. Modern minds like categories, domestic work here, sexual exploitation there. Rome did not. To a Roman owner, an enslaved woman's body was part of her labor. There was no concept of consent because there was no concept of refusal. Roman law did not define sexual violence against enslaved women as a crime. It defined it as use. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't whispered about. It was assumed, which is why Roman texts are so calm about it. One of the first things taken from a captive woman was her name. She might be renamed after her place of origin, or after a physical trait, or simply given a generic slave name. This wasn't convenience. It was control. A name ties you to memory. Rome preferred clean slates. Once renamed, she could be sold again and again, each transfer erasing more of her past. New household, new expectations, same lack of choice. Survival meant learning quickly when to speak, when to stay silent, how to anticipate moods, how to avoid attention, how to endure it when avoidance failed. This wasn't living. It was managing damage. You'll sometimes hear the argument that some enslaved people were treated well. This is where Rome plays a clever trick on history. Yes, some households were less brutal than others. Some owners were less violent. Some conditions were less punishing. But none of this changed the central reality. At any moment, kindness could be revoked. A good mood could turn. A debt could be owed. A household could fall out of favor. A woman could be sold to someone worse, and she would have no say in any of it. Temporary comfort does not equal freedom. It just delays harm. If an enslaved woman became pregnant, Rome didn't see tragedy. It saw multiplication. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status. They became property at birth. Sometimes they were raised in the same household. Sometimes they were sold young. Sometimes they were separated immediately. Motherhood did not grant safety. It deepened captivity. A woman was now responsible not only for her own endurance, but for protecting a child she had no legal right to keep. Imagine loving someone the law says is not yours. That alone could break a person. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Ancient historians were almost all elite men. They wrote about politics, wars, and philosophy. Domestic slavery, especially female suffering, was background noise to them. They didn't document it because they didn't question it. The absence of detailed accounts is not a lack of evidence. It's evidence of normalization. Battlefield death is sudden. Enslavement is slow. It stretches over years, over changing owners, over aging bodies, over fading hope. Every day becomes a negotiation with power. How visible can I be today? How invisible must I be tonight? How much of myself can I afford to lose and still survive? This kind of violence leaves no dramatic scene for history to record. Just endurance. From the outside, survival looks like mercy. From inside Rome, survival meant living without agency, without protection, without an ending. That's why ancient sources sometimes mention captives choosing death, not out of despair, but clarity. They understood what awaited them. Rome offered life, but it was not a life owned by the living. By now, it should be clear that Rome didn't stumble into cruelty. It engineered it. What happened to captive women after victory wasn't random abuse by a few cruel individuals. It was the predictable output of a massive, well-organized system. A system that turned human lives into logistics. Rome didn't just conquer land, it optimized suffering. When Roman legions marched home, they didn't return empty-handed. They brought back gold, weapons, livestock, and people. Captives were counted like inventory. Men were assessed for strength, children for adaptability, women for age, appearance, and perceived obedience. This wasn't emotional. It was transactional. Victories weren't celebrated just because enemies were defeated, but because markets would soon be flooded with new human capital. Rome ran on conquest, and conquest needed bodies. After capture, women were often herded into temporary holding areas. Conditions were brutal. Disease spread easily. Food was minimal. Death was common. And here's the dark irony. Survival through this stage often meant facing something worse. Those deemed valuable were sold at auctions. Public events where buyers examined human beings the way one inspects animals. Teeth, seeking, posture, silence, resistance, compliance increased price. Fear lowered it. Women learned this quickly. Not all enslaved women were priced the same. A young woman from a distant land might fetch more for novelty. A skilled woman, a seamstress, a musician, a midwife, might be labeled useful. Beauty mattered. So did youth. So did silence. A woman could be bought for domestic labor in the morning and rented out for profit by evening. No paperwork, no scandal, just business. If this feels unsettling, it should, because this wasn't hidden from Roman society. It was openly accepted. This is where popular imagination often goes wrong. Gladiators weren't roaming Rome, dragging women into darkness after victories. Most gladiators were enslaved themselves. They lived under strict control. They couldn't leave their training schools freely. Their lives were micromanaged because they were expensive investments. But here's the uncomfortable part. They were still part of the spectacle economy. Their fame increased demand. Their bodies symbolized dominance. Their victories fed the same culture that normalized the exploitation of captives, including women. They weren't the architects of suffering, but they were used to sell its myth. The true winners were not the fighters. They were the senators, generals, and wealthy households who profited quietly behind the scenes. A conquered city meant new land. New land meant new estates. New estates meant new labor. Women captives filled roles Rome didn't want citizens performing: cleaning, nursing, sexual availability, and silence. And if one broke, there were always more. It's tempting to imagine rebellion, escape, resistance. Rome accounted for that too. Enslaved women were often deliberately isolated. Foreign languages, constant relocation, separation from children, threats of resale. Fear was Rome's favorite guard, and it worked. Rebellion didn't fail because captives were weak. It failed because the system was designed to crush solidarity before it could form. Rome understood psychology better than it admitted. Humiliation wasn't accidental. It was instructional. A woman who had been publicly displayed, renamed, stripped of family, and denied bodily autonomy was easier to control. Shame kept her quiet. Isolation kept her compliant. Rome didn't need chains everywhere. It installed them in the mind. The most disturbing part isn't the violence itself. It's how normal it became. Children grew up seeing enslaved women serve silently. Philosophers discussed ethics while benefiting from exploitation. Poets joked about captive girls in verses meant to entertain. When cruelty becomes background noise, it no longer shocks. It simply persists. Rome wasn't ignorant. It knew enslavement destroyed lives. It knew sexual exploitation caused suffering. It knew families were torn apart, and it continued anyway, because Rome didn't measure greatness in kindness. It measured it in control. At this point, we've uncovered something important. The suffering of female captives wasn't an unfortunate side effect of Roman greatness. It was a feature. But here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because Rome didn't just exploit these women in life. It rewrote their suffering into myth, entertainment, and memory, disguising brutality as culture. Rome didn't just tolerate suffering. It staged it. By the time female captives disappeared into households, brothels, or labor camps, their pain had already served another purpose: public reassurance. Rome needed its citizens to see domination, to feel secure knowing power was absolute. And nothing reassured Rome like spectacle. To modernize, Roman entertainment looks excessive, but to Romans, it was communication. A gladiator's victory said, "Rome is strong." A public execution said, Disobedience ends here. A humiliated captive woman said, "This is what happens to the defeated." No speech is required. The message was written on bodies. Contrary to popular belief, female prisoners weren't usually thrown into gladiatorial combat against men. That fantasy belongs to modern cinema, not history. Rome preferred something subtler. Captive women appeared around the games, not as fighters, but as symbols. They were marched in triumphs, displayed in pageantry, used in mythological reenactments where their humiliation was framed as culture rather than cruelty. The arena didn't need to show rape directly. It implied it. Roman spectacles loved myths, especially violent ones. Stories where women were abducted, punished, or destroyed were reenacted publicly under the excuse of tradition. Audiences didn't see victims. They saw narratives. This mattered because myth removed responsibility. If violence happened as the gods intended, then no one in the audience had to feel uncomfortable. Rome was very good at outsourcing guilt to mythology. Take the famous myth of the Sabine women, abducted to provide wives for early Roman men. Romans didn't see this as a crime story. They saw it as a foundation myth. The lesson wasn't about consent. It was about necessity, about survival, about Rome doing what it had to do. This logic didn't stay in the past. It justified the present. One of the strangest elements of Roman culture is how casually suffering was joked about. Poets like Martial wrote witty lines about enslaved women. Satirists made jokes about foreign girls being exotic. Audiences laughed, not because they were monsters, but because repetition had numbed them. Humor made violence digestible. Laughter is powerful. Laughter is powerful. It tells the mind this is normal. Once something is funny, it becomes safe. Once it becomes safe, it becomes invisible. And once it's invisible, it can continue indefinitely. Rome didn't need constant terror. It needed acceptance. Here's a detail history rarely lingers on. Roman women were often present at games. They watched captives paraded. They saw enslaved women punished. They understood, silently, where power ended and vulnerability began. The lesson wasn't lost on them. This wasn't just entertainment. It was instruction. Ancient sources rarely describe sexual violence explicitly. This isn't because it didn't happen. It's because Roman authors didn't consider it remarkable. Silence in the sources is not innocence. It's normalization. After the crowds went home, the system kept working. Women were sold again, reassigned, loaned out, broken down by years of use, replaced. Rome's economy thrived because someone always paid the price, and that price was often female. At this stage, the phrase "worse than death" stops sounding dramatic. Death meant an end. Life in bondage meant repetition of fear, of humiliation, of powerlessness. Rome didn't just conquer bodies. It occupied time. This is the contradiction at the heart of the empire. Rome built roads, laws, aqueducts, philosophy, and at the same time, it reduced human beings, especially conquered women, into resources. Both truths existed together, comfortably. By now, one thing should be clear. What happened to female prisoners after Roman victories wasn't chaos. It was choreography, and the most disturbing part? It worked. History loves numbers. Thousands captured, cities sacked, empires expanded. But captivity was never experienced in numbers. It was experienced one woman at a time. For many female prisoners, the most terrifying moment wasn't the battle. It was the quiet afterward. The shouting faded, weapons lowered, fires burned down to embers. And suddenly, survival no longer meant running. It meant waiting. Waiting to be chosen. The first thing captivity erased was identity. Names were rarely recorded. Lineage didn't matter. Past lives dissolved instantly. A woman could be a priestess, a mother, a healer, and within hours, she became inventory. Roman records were efficient. Human ones were not. Before Rome ever saw them, captives traveled. Chain marches. Ships packed beyond capacity. Hunger disguised as logistics. Disease treated as inconvenience. This stage mattered because it conditioned submission. By the time women reached Roman soil, resistance had already been punished out of them. Being sold wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Some women entered households. Others were rented out. Some were reassigned repeatedly. A body passed between owners like a tool. Rome had a word for this efficiency. It called it order. This needs to be said clearly without euphemism. An enslaved woman could not refuse. Not legally. Not socially. Not practically. Any sexual access demanded was considered a right of ownership. Roman law did not define this as violence. It defined it as entitlement. What made captivity unbearable wasn't always brutality. It was repetition, being summoned, dismissed, watched, evaluated, corrected, used. Every day reduced the distance between body and object. Pregnancy did not equal protection. Children born to enslaved women belonged to the owner, not the mother. A baby was not a blessing. It was inventory with potential. Hollywood loves escape stories. Rome made them unlikely. Foreign women lacked language, money, networks, or legal standing. Even if they fled, returning home was nearly impossible. And punishment for escape was public. Rome didn't need walls everywhere. Fear did the job. Some women adapted, not because they accepted captivity, but because resistance took different forms. Remembering names, teaching songs quietly, preserving rituals in silence, choosing when to emotionally disappear. Survival wasn't always visible. One of the least documented aspects of Roman slavery is solidarity between women. But hints exist. Shared tasks, quiet warnings, mutual care during illness, passing down knowledge of when silence was safer than speech. Rome controlled bodies. It never fully controlled memory. Ancient historians rarely wrote about these inner lives, not because they didn't exist, because they weren't considered historically important. Wars mattered. Emperors mattered. Buildings mattered. Women endured in footnotes, if at all. By now, the phrase should feel heavy. Death was a moment. Captivity was duration. It stretched across years, across pregnancies, across stolen futures, across generations. Rome didn't just take lives. It consumed them slowly. Some women survived long enough to be freed. Manumission happened. But freedom didn't erase memory. It didn't restore family. It didn't return time. Rome could release bodies. It never returned what captivity removed. By this point, it should be clear, Rome didn't rely on chaos to enforce cruelty. It relied on systems, invisible, well-oiled, and relentless. And in these systems, gladiators played a role that is often misunderstood. Movies love to portray gladiators as wild men lording over the helpless, dragging women into dark corners after victories. In reality, the story is far more nuanced. Most gladiators were slaves themselves, trained from youth in Ludus schools, their lives controlled with military precision. They were performers, athletes, and living investments. Their victories in the arena were public, yes, but they didn't translate into private power over captives. In fact, the arena often limited their freedom. Their fame gave them status, not autonomy. And when it came to female captives, gladiators were observers, symbols of Roman dominance, not perpetrators. The true architects of captivity's horror were Rome's elite: generals, senators, wealthy householders. They decided who lived, who was displayed, who would serve. They profited from auctions, trades, and labor systems that kept women under total control. Gladiators were part of the spectacle economy. Yes, but they were cogs, not controllers. The stage existed to elevate them as entertainment, reinforcing the social hierarchy. At the same time, the elite benefited from both public spectacle and private exploitation. It wasn't enough for the Romans to conquer land. They needed conquered people, especially women, to be visible evidence of their dominance. Parades in the streets? Check. Triumphs where women were displayed like trophies? Check. Mythological reenactments where their humiliation was scripted? Check. Every act served a purpose. Remind the citizenry who controlled the world and who had no choice within it. Humiliation wasn't cruelty by accident. It was political theater sanctioned by law and society. Roman power was intertwined with commerce. Female captives were not just objects of domination, but economic units. Some were assigned domestic labor. Others were rented, sold, or exploited for profit. A single conquest could provide decades of income, especially if women were trained, skilled, or beautiful. Their labor fed households, their presence entertained guests, and their very bodies were currency. Every transaction reinforced the system, making cruelty predictable and profitable. Gladiators' victories symbolized Rome's control over bodies and territories. They were the living punctuation marks in a culture that wrote dominance into every corner of society. Their fame made games profitable. Their combat skills made the public applaud. Their survival reminded everyone that even those who fought for glory were still bound by Rome's rules. Meanwhile, the women who had been marched in the parade or sold at auction were trapped in silence and invisibility. The gladiators' performance didn't change their suffering. It only made the elite feel justified. It's easy to get lost in architecture, numbers, and anecdotes. But behind every triumph, every parade, every carefully orchestrated myth were individuals enduring systemic trauma. These women faced loss of autonomy, every decision, every moment controlled, repeated exploitation, labor, sexual, emotional, social erasure, names, families, and identities stripped away. Intergenerational consequences, children born into slavery, continuing cycles of suffering. The arena may have glorified violence and sport, but the real work of domination happened in quiet households, auction blocks, and private chambers. Resistance in shadows. Despite overwhelming control, women often found ways to survive. Not dramatic escape stories, but subtle acts. Preserving memory through song or ritual, quietly helping each other avoid punishment, enduring hardship without breaking mentally so they could navigate the next day. These small acts weren't heroic in the cinematic sense, but they were real, human, and resilient. Survival became its own quiet form of resistance, a rebellion that Rome could never fully see. Rome normalized cruelty in subtle ways. Humor was one tool. Satirical poetry joked about captive women. Reenactments of mythical abductions entertained spectators. For the public, repeated exposure made suffering digestible. It became background noise. The gladiators' feats, the crowd cheers, and the parades all combined to mask systemic violence as culture. This made it harder for contemporaries to perceive horror as horror. And for us, it challenges how we interpret the evidence today. When modern readers scan Tacitus, Josephus, Juvenal, or Martial, it's tempting to think female captives are missing because nothing happened to them. The truth is the opposite. Their suffering was so ordinary that it didn't merit note. Roman historians rarely recorded private pain. Only political, military, or architectural achievements. Absence in the sources does not mean absence in reality. It means normalization, invisibility, and control. Step back and look at the system. 1. Military conquest captures bodies. 2. Parades and games display domination publicly. 3. Auctions and households convert people into economic units. 4. Daily life under slavery enforces obedience, erases identity, and perpetuates trauma. Gladiators occupy step 2. Women occupy steps 1, 3, and 4. The system worked because it was multi-layered, relentless, and morally insulated. It wasn't a glitch. It was intentionally designed. Death is finite. Captivity is endless. An ongoing erosion of body, mind, and identity. For female captives, life in Rome often meant witnessing power without influence, enduring humiliation without relief, producing children who would inherit the same chains. No single act of violence compares to the duration, repetition, and invisibility of captivity. The destruction of Jerusalem under Titus is one of Rome's most infamous campaigns. Thousands were killed. Tens of thousands were taken captive. Among them were women and children, swept into slavery as part of Rome's reward system. Josephus, a Jewish historian who survived the siege, provides critical insight. He describes the city's devastation and the fate of those who remained, sold into households, employed as laborers, or publicly displayed as proof of Roman conquest. While these writings may seem lighthearted, they reveal cultural norms. The humor masks systemic abuse, showing that society was desensitized. Women's suffering was commonplace enough to inspire jokes, further normalizing the cruelty that legal and social structures allowed. Whether in Judea, Gaul, Germania, or elsewhere, the same patterns emerge. 1. Capture in war. Women taken as part of military campaigns. 2. Public display. Parades, pageants, and mythological reenactments. 3. Auction or assignment. Sold to households, labor camps, or sexual servitude. 4. Long-term exploitation, repeated abuse, loss of autonomy, and intergenerational impact. The worse than death experience was structural, not anecdotal. It was the predictable consequence of Rome's integration of conquest, commerce, and spectacle. Despite the horror, some captives developed subtle methods of coping, preserving identity, quietly remembering family names, teaching children what could be preserved. Emotional resilience, learning when to speak, when to remain silent. Alliances, forming bonds with other women to share knowledge and aid survival. These tactics didn't free them. They didn't erase trauma, but they allowed for human agency in a system designed to strip it away. It's important to note that gladiators themselves were not the primary perpetrators. Modern portrayals often dramatize sexual violence as part of arena life. Reality is different. Gladiators fought in controlled bouts. Women's suffering occurred around the spectacle, orchestrated by elite structures, not the performers themselves. Blaming gladiators oversimplifies the historical reality. The system was far more sophisticated, terrifyingly so, and women were caught in it from multiple angles. War, society, economy, and culture. Why do sources remain vague? Ancient historians focused on political, military, and architectural achievements. Women's private suffering was considered irrelevant for their narratives. This silence is part of the system. If nobody records it, it becomes invisible to history, which makes it easier to repeat. And yet, the indirect evidence, triumphs, legal texts, satire, and archaeology allows us to reconstruct the lived reality. Every parade, auction, and assignment documented indirectly tells the story. A life controlled, exploited, and erased. Through these case studies, a pattern emerges. Siege capture, display, exploitation, invisibility. Gladiators provided spectacle, not sexual violence. Elites maintained control. Women endured long-term psychological and social trauma. This isn't just historical curiosity. It's a lesson about how systems can perpetuate suffering without direct violence at every moment. Structures, culture, and legal frameworks combine to make lives miserable, slowly, methodically, and quietly. By now, the picture should be clear. Roman captivity and spectacle were systemic, deliberate, and psychologically devastating. But what made this experience truly worse than death? Death, for all its finality, is a single moment. It ends pain abruptly. Captivity, on the other hand, stretched suffering across years, even generations. Imagine waking up every day knowing that every choice is no longer yours. What to eat, when to sleep, what to wear, whom to speak to, even whom to love, all dictated by someone else. For Roman female captives, this was reality. Life was measured in obedience, performance, and survival. Autonomy wasn't just lost, it was erased from daily existence. And unlike death, which is sudden, this erasure is slow, persistent, and intimate. The horror wasn't always physical, though that existed. It was the repetition of humiliation, exploitation, and loss, being displayed publicly during triumphs, being sold or reassigned like property, experiencing forced labor or sexual exploitation repeatedly. Imagine a life where trauma wasn't an event. It was a pattern recurring every day. Even if moments of kindness appeared, they were often strategic or temporary. Trauma defined the environment, making resilience necessary for survival. Captivity also erased identity and social context. Names were often stripped, replaced with labels or numbers. Family ties were severed. Cultural and religious practices had to be hidden or abandoned. This wasn't just psychological, it was social annihilation. The captive's past life, skills, and knowledge were often treated as irrelevant, leaving women in existential limbo. Worse still, the effects extended to children. Offspring born into slavery were automatically enslaved. Trauma didn't end with the first generation. It propagated, ensuring that the system's power persisted. This creates a chilling reality. Captivity wasn't just a temporary suffering. It was a lifelong, family-spanning condition that blurred the line between individual and collective oppression. At this point, it's worth revisiting the role of gladiators. Gladiators fought for fame, survival, and sometimes life itself. They were often celebrated by the crowd, but their victories did not confer control over female captives. Though worse than death, reality was structural. The system itself, law, economy, social norms, enabled and perpetuated the trauma. Gladiators were participants in spectacle, but the real architects were Rome's political and social elites. As we look back, several lessons emerge. 1. Power structures matter. Cruelty doesn't need a villain if the system itself enforces it. 2. Invisibility is a tool of oppression. When suffering isn't recorded, it's easier to perpetuate. 3. Psychological trauma can surpass physical harm. Repeated exploitation, humiliation, and control often have deeper and longer-lasting effects than violence that ends quickly. These reflections help us interpret historical events responsibly, without sensationalizing them. Understanding history is not about shock value. It's about human insight, empathy, and lessons for the present. Modern society still grapples with systemic power, exploitation, and gendered violence. Studying Roman practices isn't just academic. It provides perspective, media, and spectacle. Ancient audiences normalized cruelty for entertainment, just as modern audiences are desensitized to certain forms of violence. Structural oppression, laws, culture, and economy can reinforce suffering, often invisibly. Resilience and agency. Despite immense control, individuals find ways to survive, preserve identity, and resist, sometimes quietly, sometimes subtly. History offers not just horror, but insight, teaching us to recognize patterns, empathize, and avoid repeating mistakes. It's tempting to dwell only on facts, battles, triumphs, auctions. But history is lived experience. Imagine being marched in a parade, barefoot and exposed. Witnessing others sold while knowing your fate could follow. Living in a house where every word, gesture, or glance could be monitored. This is why captivity was psychologically more devastating than death. Every day was a test of endurance, a slow erosion of self, and a negotiation with fear. Even as we recount these horrors, we can reflect gently. Women endured in ways Rome never acknowledged. They survived, adapted, and sometimes left traces, songs, stories, or traditions that quietly resisted erasure. Their stories remind us that human dignity persists, even under impossible circumstances. As we reach the end of this journey, It's worth taking a moment to pause and breathe. History can be harsh, but it also teaches us about human resilience, morality, and reflection. We have walked through the streets of ancient Rome, felt the shadow of conquest, witnessed the spectacle of triumphs, and glimpsed the lives of women whose experiences were, in many ways, worse than death. We explored how gladiators, often misunderstood as perpetrators, were themselves part of a grand system of power, spectacle, and control. The story of Roman captivity is not just about brutality. It's about systems of oppression, resilience in the face of control, and the endurance of human dignity. Power structures can quietly perpetuate suffering without visible villains. Visibility matters. Those whose suffering is ignored or erased often endure the worst. Resilience and subtle agency are human constants. Even in the harshest conditions, people find ways to preserve identity, hope, and small victories. History allows us to reflect on our own society. Are there systems today that quietly enforce suffering? Are there voices we fail to hear? Studying the past is a gentle reminder to remain aware, empathetic, and conscious of human dignity. Even in captivity, in conditions we can scarcely imagine, women survived. They adapted. They endured, sometimes invisibly, often silently. Their stories are not always recorded in history books, but their existence, courage, and resilience resonate through time. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson. Even when life seems dominated by control and cruelty, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and resist. That quiet strength is something worth carrying forward in our own lives. As you listen, you may feel a mix of emotions: sorrow, empathy, curiosity, even a touch of disbelief. That is natural. History is not just a series of events. It is human experience distilled across centuries. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. The freedoms you enjoy, the choices you make, the empathy you extend. Let these reflections be gentle, not heavy. Let the endurance of those who suffered long ago inspire gratitude, mindfulness, and perspective in your daily life. Before you drift further into rest, ask yourself, how do we treat systems and structures that can hurt without being visible? What small acts of agency and dignity can make a difference, even in constrained circumstances? These questions are not for immediate answers, but for slow reflection, the kind that grows quietly in your mind as you relax. Now, it's time to let history settle and allow your mind to drift. Imagine the soft Roman night, the quiet streets, the stars over the Colosseum, and the whispers of those long ago who survived. Breathe in, let your thoughts soften, and feel gratitude for the safety and choice that your own life allows. As you exhale, let the lessons of resilience, courage, and reflection guide you into calm and rest. Let history teach without overwhelming. Let empathy rise gently and let your body relax. Good night, my friend. May your sleep be peaceful, restorative, and filled with calm reflection.